Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another Mammoth Site video. Today we're going to be talking about paleontology and the 4th of July. And in particular, one of our founding fathers, actually a number of them if I remember correctly.
Yeah. But specifically we'll be talking about Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence.
Absolutely, yeah. Thomas Jefferson, much like many of the other founding fathers, they were students of that new European idea that was kind of coming through, that age of the Enlightenment, you know, the idea of the age of reason as it's sometimes referred to, where people were kind of thinking about science and all of these different things in new ways. And one of the interesting things, and I always like to point out, is that part of that, although it wasn't really a science at that point, was, you know, looking at paleontology.
Yeah. Jefferson did like to go out and search for big bones, especially at places such as Big Bone Lake in Kentucky.
Absolutely, yeah. At the time, throughout parts of this part of world history and American history, and we're going to be focusing on the American history because it is the 4th of July. People were finding these big bones, these bones of animals that they couldn't quite figure out what they were coming from, and so it was kind of the start of trying to figure out exactly, at least in the United States, what these bones were. Now, human beings have been finding fossils since human beings have been a thing. And they've been trying to figure out exactly, what they mean through this time. And so this is just kind of one chapter of the history of paleontology. And so with that, when we talk about Thomas Jefferson, there's two that often come to mind when I think of Thomas Jefferson. First and foremost, this guy right here, Megalonyx. He was the one who described Megalonyx, if I remember correctly.
Yes, he did.
Yeah. So he was looking at bones that were found in what is now West Virginia. And he was describing, these long forearm bones. He saw some really big claws, and he came up with the name Megalonyx, or the large claw, the giant claw. Now, what's interesting about his initial description is it wasn't really what we think of it, what we think of Megalonyx as today. So now we know Megalonyx was, a giant ground sloth. So think, almost an elephant-sized sloth walking around. But what did Thomas Jefferson think they were?
He actually thought it was a lion, such as our friend the American lion right here. And what's funny is he's not too far off, because the American lion did live as far as the East Coast. So it could have been found back in the day. They just didn't find it.
Absolutely, yes. So, much like paleontologists today, he was curious about the natural world, and so he was looking at these things. He was trying to figure out what exactly they were. The main difference I would say is he was kind of he thought he kind of came up with the idea of it's a cat-like animal, and then looked for evidence that would support that instead of figuring out what the evidence was that he had first, and then kind of arriving at a conclusion from there. So it's important to know that although it was some of the first parts of paleontology, it wasn't quite the paleontology we see today, but much with any science, the first step of asking questions, or the first step an early part of the process is either being right or wrong about something, and then trying to test that idea and trying to figure out what exactly works and what makes the most sense with the evidence we have. And it's still something we do today in paleontology. Is we gather our evidence, we look at the fossil resources we find, and try to figure out what those are telling us, and then try to arrive at a conclusion based off that evidence. So in addition to Megalonyx, we also often think about mastodons and mammoths with Thomas Jefferson. Now, Thomas Jefferson, he used mammoth and mastodon kind of interchangeably, but that's kind of with good reason, because if I remember correctly, George Cuvier hadn't really coined the term that we now think of today as being this is what a mammoth is, until about 1806. So it was kind of after Thomas Jefferson was, at first looking at them. So he would actually display fossils that were found in his home in Monticello. So he would kind of, he was almost one of the, he was an early American natural history museum almost, where he would have fossils on display that he would show guests and kind of describe what he was seeing with them and trying to figure out exactly what those meant for the world. An interesting chapter of that as well is the Lewis and Clark expeditions.
Yeah. One of the reasons that he was sending Lewis and Clark out west was because Jefferson believed at the time that no species ever truly went extinct, and therefore that there must have been herds of mastodons out west hiding somewhere in the American wilderness.
Absolutely. If we think about at the time, especially for the Americans living on the East Coast, a lot of them had these stories they heard about the American West were these stories from fur trappers, and much like with people that when they go on when they're traveling, sometimes our memory kind of gets altered a little bit in the idea that maybe we see one thing and it kind of we kind of embellish the story a little bit to make it a little bit more interesting. So for the most part, a lot of that was for at least to people living in the cities on the East Coast wasn't really something that was explored. And so the idea that there could have been mammoths and mastodons there was definitely like, with the not too far from what they thought of of something that was possible. Now, of course, it's also important to note, like you mentioned, that he didn't really think extinction was something that could have happened, and it wasn't really. That was kind of like the standard of the time, where extinction was kind of it wasn't really a thought of idea. It was more of just the animals we have today were the animals we always had. Much like I said earlier, the first step to being figuring stuff out is we sometimes we're wrong about some assumptions we make. We're wrong about some stuff, and the evidence we find tells us that it's another thing. So it's one of the really neat things to kind of think about that. Although Thomas Jefferson wrote these magnificent documents like the Declaration of Independence, he was still wrong every once in a while. Also used them to kind of settle almost a feud he had with some French naturalists. Do you want to go into that a little bit?
Yeah, so there was this French naturalist who believed that everything from the Old World was bigger and better than fauna and flora in the New World, and that you wouldn't find any big animals here in the New World. And Jefferson was like, I have a problem with that.
Absolutely. If you look at, I'm going to grab the femur from a mammoth, which was a bone similar to the ones they were finding from things like mastodon. You can see this comes from a pretty large animal. And it's some of the ones in like the Columbian mammoths and such were actually bigger than some of the smaller woollies that were found in Europe and Eurasia. So in some ways, some of the animals were actually even a little bit bigger.
He's right.
Now, when Thomas Jefferson was president, so we talked about how he brought bones to Monticello and put them on display, almost kind of like an early natural history museum. But when he was president, he also brought them to the White House.
Yeah, not only that, but because he brought bones to the White House, he was actually teased for it in a couple of poems.
Yeah. But it's interesting because, as we talked about earlier with, Lewis and Clark expedition, Thomas Jefferson telling them to kind of be on the lookout for, living mastodons and mammoths, out in the American West. It's interesting because that means, at some point, Meriwether Lewis actually saw the bones that were uncovered in Virginia, and it was part of, almost probably part of his duties as, Thomas Jefferson's secretary.
Yeah. And he's not our only founding father who enjoyed paleontology. Why don't you tell us about George Washington, Seth?
Yeah, George Washington, much like Thomas Jefferson, they're both landowners. They're both George Washington himself was a surveyor, and so they at the time, these students of the Enlightenment, they were curious about the natural world. So they would hear about they would actually, I believe George Washington actually he left a campaign at one point to go take a look at some fossils that were found. Or what at the time they didn't really know them as fossils. Fossil was actually kind of a word that was used to describe anything that was in the ground, so it could also include rocks and minerals. But he wanted to go take a look at that at this material and figure out, okay, what are we looking at? Why are these giant bones there? And so it's kind of neat to see that George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin was another one who Ben Franklin often is thought of as being as we often think of him as one of the early American inventors and scientists. He was interested in paleontology as well, looking at, here's this stuff in the natural world, let's make some observations on it, try to figure out what exactly it is. Okay? It's one of the fun things with, as we kind of been talking about in this video is, paleontology, it hasn't always been a science, but fossils have always been around. And so these early United States founding fathers, they were seeing fossils whether or not they knew what truly was as a fossil. And so them trying to figure out exactly what they were looking at, they were right about some stuff where they identified them as bones, but they didn't really necessarily see it as we see it today, whereas this is these are the remains of a long extinct animal.
Yeah. But if it wasn't for them, paleontology may not be as popular today as it is.
Absolutely, it's one of those things where as with every science, you got to start somewhere. And so in the United States, we can honestly thank Thomas Jefferson for Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, George Washington, kind of for getting that foundation in United States paleontology. And to that end, if I remember correctly, Megalonyx, when it was officially described and given a scientific name, it's one of the species is Megalonyx jeffersoni, meaning Jefferson's Megalonyx. Kind of as an homage to him describing that first, looking at those bones and trying to figure out what they were. There's also Mammoths jeffersoni. There are some scientists that use Jefferson's mammoth as a name for a species of mammoth. Kind of again as an homage to one of the early American paleontologists, or you could at the very least a paleontology enthusiast. Mm-hmm. But yeah, with that, we wanted to share a little bit of fun information that we found about the founding fathers and paleontology, especially Ice Age paleontology as the Mammoth Site. It's always kind of neat to see that mammoths we find them here in South Dakota, but Ice Age animals have been found all over North America, all over the world, and trying to figure out exactly all of, some of the, the neat stories from our past as humans and our historical past to learn that, where there people were still studying prehistory. So with that, is there anything else you'd like to add, Colin?
I think we're good.
All right. Well, then I want to thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you have a happy and safe 4th of July, and we'll see you next time.